Imagine a cold November morning in 1315. A long column of Europe's finest soldiers, thousands of elite armored knights, marches confidently into a narrow mountain pass in the Swiss Alps. This is the Habsburg army, the very symbol of feudal power. Their armor gleams, their war horses are strong, and their commanders are certain of a swift victory. They are here to crush a rebellion and remind a few troublesome mountain communities who is in charge. But high above them, hidden on the steep, forested slopes, a small group of local farmers and herders watches and waits. They have no heavy armor, no cavalry, and no noble titles. What they do have is a deep knowledge of their land and a plan. This isn't just a battle, it's a direct challenge to the entire medieval world order. What happened next in that narrow pass would send shockwaves across Europe, proving that even the most powerful armies can be brought to their knees when the rules of the game are suddenly changed. This is the story of the Battle of Morgarten, where peasant militias humiliated Europe's elite knights and questioned the very foundations of the feudal system. The date was November 15th, 1315. The place was a treacherous path squeezed between a steep, wooded hillside and the freezing waters of an alpine lake. For a large, organized army, this terrain was a nightmare. Movement was severely restricted, forcing the soldiers into a long, thin, and vulnerable line. This was the trap. Marching straight into it was the mighty army of Duke Leopold, the first of Habsburg, a force made up primarily of heavily armored cavalry. These weren't just soldiers. They were the embodiment of Europe's military and social hierarchy. They represented a system built on a rigid pyramid of power. Nobles ruled, knights enforced their will, and common people obeyed without question. In II's world, knights were considered practically invincible. Their advantage came from a lifetime of combat training, incredibly expensive armor and war, and a divinely ordained social status that placed them above all others. The Habsburg commanders didn't just expect an easy victory. They saw it as their natural right. They believed they were facing nothing more than a disorganized rabble of peasants. So why was this conflict even happening? It all came down to a clash of two very different ways of life. The alpine communities of Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden had developed a unique form of self-governance. They ran their own affairs through local assemblies and, crucially, paid taxes directly to the Holy Roman Emperor, bypassing the authority of regional nobles like the Habsburgs. This independence, known as Imperial immediacy, was a direct threat to the feudal power structure. The Habsburgs saw this autonomy as a dangerous spark that could ignite similar ideas elsewhere. Adding to the tension, the region controlled valuable trade routes through the Alps, making it strategically and economically vital. The Swiss communities had tried diplomacy, sending appeals to have their traditional rights recognized, but their pleas were ignored. Tensions finally boiled over after a raid on a monastery that had ties to Habsburg authority. For the Habsburgs, this was the final straw. It was time to make an example of these defiant peasants. The Habsburg strategy was designed to be a public spectacle of overwhelming force. The campaign was meant to be quick, decisive, and intimidating. The goal wasn't just to win a battle, but to reassert feudal control so completely that no one would ever dare challenge it again. Confident in their superiority, the army advanced deep into the mountain pass in a dense, tightly packed formation. They were a river of steel flowing into a canyon, completely unaware that the canyon itself was about to become their enemy. While the knights marched, the Swiss fighters were busy preparing the battlefield. Using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, they had hauled massive rocks and logs to the top of the slope directly above the narrowest part of the pass. They identified the exact point where the Habsburg column would be most constricted. Returning back would be almost impossible. Their plan wasn't based on military might, but on gravity, timing, and local intelligence. They were turning the pass itself into a weapon, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash it. As the Habsburg column stretched deeper into the narrow corridor, they became fully committed. The front of the line was far ahead, the rear was still entering the pass, and there was no room to maneuver. Retreat was no longer an option. Then, at the precise moment chosen by the waiting Swiss, the signal was given. High above, the simple barriers holding back the makeshift avalanche were removed. With a terrifying roar, tons of rocks, logs, and debris were sent crashing down the steep slope, directly into the heart of the unsuspecting army below. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The surprise was absolute. Horses, terrified by the noise and the falling debris, panicked, reared, and fell, throwing their heavily armored riders to the ground. The tightly packed column disintegrated into chaos. The path became blocked by fallen men, panicked animals, and a landslide of rock and wood. Soldiers at the front couldn't move forward, and those at the back couldn't retreat. Some were pushed sideways, stumbling into the icy waters of the lake. Their expensive, heavy armor, designed for open field combat, now became a deadly weight, severely limiting their mobility and dragging some to a watery grave. The proud Habsburg army was trapped, broken, and helpless. And that's when the second phase of the ambush began. From the slopes above, the Swiss fighters descended on the chaotic scene. They moved in small, agile groups, wielding weapons perfectly suited for this moment. Many carried long polearms, like the halberd, which were designed not to break armor but to hook and pull knights from their saddles. Their tactics were simple and brutal. Isolated individual knights, bring the armored giants to the ground where they were clumsy and vulnerable, and finish the job. The expensive plate armor that was supposed to make a knight invincible now became his prison. On T-ground, unable to get up quickly, he was an easy target. This was not warfare as the knights understood it. Medieval combat among nobles followed a strict code of conduct. There were formal surrender rituals, and high-ranking prisoners were often captured and held for a hefty ransom. But the Swiss were not nobles. They weren't playing by those rules. For them, this was not a chivalrous contest. It was a desperate fight for survival. They offered no quarter and took no prisoners for ransom. The fighting was brutally practical and ruthlessly efficient. In just a short amount of time, the battle was over, and the outcome was decisive. The great Habsburg army was utterly routed. Those who weren't killed were forced to flee in a desperate scramble for their lives. Duke Leopold himself barely escaped with his life, retreating in humiliation. The defeat was swift, total, and deeply embarrassing. In the aftermath, Habsburg chroniclers and their allies struggled to comprehend what had happened. How could the flower of European chivalry be defeated by a small band of peasants? They looked for any explanation that didn't challenge their worldview. They blamed the treacherous terrain, the bad weather, and just plain bad luck. What they failed to acknowledge, or perhaps refused to see, was the brilliant tactical planning and the clever use of geography that had secured the Swiss victory. They couldn't admit that strategy had triumphed over social status, but the truth couldn't be contained. News of the incredible victory at Morgarten spread quickly across Europe through merchants, travelers, and pilgrims. The story created a widespread sense of unease among the nobility. It was a terrifying revelation. The battle demonstrated two earth-shattering facts. First, that elite armored cavalry was not invincible, and second, that a well-prepared local force could defeat a traditional professional army. The political consequences were immediate. The Alpine communities, emboldened by their success, formalized their alliance for mutual defense. This pact became the foundation of the old Swiss Confederacy, the forerunner of modern-day Switzerland. More regions, inspired by their example, joined the Confederation over time. Swiss infantrymen, armed with their halberds and pikes, quickly gained a fearsome reputation across Europe for their discipline, courage, and effectiveness. The military legacy of Morgarten was profound. Armies across the continent began to rethink the fundamentals of warfare. The age of unquestioned cavalry dominance was coming to an end. Military leaders started placing a greater emphasis on disciplined infantry and paying much closer attention to the tactical importance of terrain. The core belief that social rank automatically guaranteed military success had been permanently weakened. Morgarten was more than just a military victory. It was a powerful challenge to the entire feudal belief system. It was a clear demonstration that power ultimately depends on strategy and preparation, not on noble birth or expensive equipment. The psychological impact of that realization lasted far longer than the battle itself. Today, you can visit the site of the battle. The landscape, though changed, still clearly shows why that narrow pass was so decisive. Morgarten has become a powerful symbol of resistance, tactical innovation, and the inherent limits of inherited power. The central takeaway from that fateful day is that any hierarchy enforced by tradition alone is fragile. When the established rules are ignored and a new game is played, long-standing systems can fail spectacularly. The Battle of Morgarten marks the moment when Europe's deeply ingrained assumptions about power and society were publicly shattered, and they were never again fully restored. Thanks for watching. If you found this story of ingenuity and defiance as fascinating as I do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. See you next time.